This has to be one of the most extreme economic stories ever told. It's a real-life paradox, a tale of rags to riches, and then, believe it or not, right back to rags again.
So let's just start with the big question, right? How on earth does a country, any country, manage to lose over 90% of its gross domestic product? I mean, that's a catastrophic collapse that seems almost impossible.
Well, the answer can be found on this tiny little speck of land in the South Pacific. This is Nauru, the third smallest nation on Earth. And let me tell you, what it lacks in size, it more than makes up for in economic lessons.
Okay, so our story kicks off with the discovery of an accidental and, frankly, a very unusual treasure. You see, when Europeans first showed up in 1789, they actually called it Pleasant Island because it was this lush, green paradise. But that did not last. Decades of mining completely transformed the place into what National Geographic would later call a ghastly tract of land, basically a barren moonscape. So what could possibly cause such a dramatic change?
The answer is phosphate ore. Now, to put it simply, it's basically dried up bird poop and algae. Yeah, I know, it sounds pretty gross. But this stuff was the key ingredient for fertilizer, which made it unbelievably valuable for feeding a rapidly growing world. And get this, 80% of the entire island was just covered in it.
So, for over half a century, Nauru was just exploited. I mean, first it was Germany, then Australia, then Japan during World War II. And then Australia took over again. But in 1968, everything changed. Nauru finally gained its independence and, for the very first time, took full control of its own incredible wealth.
And this is where the story just goes off the rails. Because for a brief shining moment, Nauru wasn't just rich, it was richer than pretty much everyone.
Just wrap your head around this number for a second. By 1981, Nauru's GDP per capita was the equivalent of $88,000 today. That is a staggering amount of money for any nation, let alone a tiny, isolated island in the middle of nowhere. And to really put that into perspective, back in 1981, the average person in Nauru was literally, and I mean literally, twice as rich as the average American. This wasn't just a boom, it was an economic miracle.
And life at the top? It was surreal. The government gave everyone free healthcare, free education. There were absolutely no taxes. So much money was flowing in from the phosphate that most citizens just chose not to work. It got so crazy that sports cars became a common sight on an island you could drive around in less than an hour.
But, as you can probably guess, this paradise came with a paradox. The very thing that made Nauru so rich was also planting the seeds of its own destruction. I mean, get this. This one little story perfectly illustrates the problem. The island's police chief imported a Lamborghini, the ultimate symbol of wealth. But he couldn't actually drive it because he was physically too large to fit inside. And while that was his personal problem, it was a huge hint at a much larger national crisis. Here's the crucial point. All that wealth came at a profound cost. With so much money to import everything, the traditional diet of fish and coconuts was replaced by cheap, processed junk food. And because decades of mining had completely destroyed the topsoil, growing fresh food was nearly impossible. Before long, Nauru had one of the worst obesity and diabetes rates in the entire world.
You know, economists actually have a name for this. It's called Dutch disease. It's what happens when a country strikes it rich with one single resource. It becomes so completely dependent on it that every other part of the economy, like farming or manufacturing, just withers away because it can't possibly compete. For Nauru, this wasn't just Dutch disease, it was Dutch disease on steroids.
Now, Nauru's leaders, they weren't totally clueless. They knew the phosphate would eventually run out. They tried to diversify, but their attempts turned into this series of catastrophic bets that basically gambled the nation's entire future away. The bad bets just started piling up. First, they tried offshore banking. That just turned the country into a haven for money laundering and got them hit with international sanctions. Then, their sovereign wealth fund, the money that was supposed to secure their future, lost millions to fraud and terrible investments until the central bank itself went bankrupt. And then, there was the musical. No, I am not kidding. Nauru invested millions in a London theater flop called Leonardo the Musical and lost every single penny. So, by the early 2000s, it was all over. The phosphate was gone, the investments had failed, the country was broke, and the aftermath? It was absolutely devastating. The numbers are just brutal to look at. Unemployment skyrocketed to 90%. The school system completely collapsed. The richest country in the world had become one of the poorest, all within the span of a single generation. Desperate for any kind of income, Nauru turned to a new and pretty controversial industry. It started taking money from Australia to host an offshore detention center for asylum seekers. Foreign aid and this facility became the only things keeping the island's economy afloat.
This quote from a Nauruan church minister, it really just gets to the heart of the tragedy. He said, "I wish we'd never discovered that phosphate. It was so beautiful. There were trees, it was green everywhere. Now I see what's happened here and I want to cry." It's just such a powerful reminder of the human cost behind all these economic figures.
So where does all this leave Nauru on our leaderboard? Well, its tiny size gets a 1 out of 10. GDP per capita has crashed back down to the global average, so that's a 5. Stability is a low 3, given its terrible track record. Growth is a surprisingly high 9, but here's the catch. It's all driven by foreign aid, not a real industry, which gets a 2. This gives Nauru an overall score of just 4 out of 10. It really does stand today as the ultimate cautionary tale, a story of how a nation can have all the money in the world and still lose everything.